Welcome to the midterm review of 1413. So now, as I mentioned before, there will be three types of questions in the exam. There will be true, false, and uncertain questions. These are questions where you're given a statement and you're going to ascertain whether the statement is true, false, or uncertain. True means essentially it's strictly true and it's always true. False means it's strictly false and there's a counterexample that shows it's false. And uncertain means like without having further information, you cannot actually answer the question necessarily, or you cannot really make a statement whether that statement is true or false. In any of what you do, please always explain your answers carefully. So just writing true, false, or uncertain will almost surely or will surely not give you full credit. You have to explain your answers. It doesn't actually matter that much whether you get it right or the statement is true or false or uncertain, as long as your answer is actually reasonable and sort of shows some understanding of the material. So the quality of your answer is quite important. We also want you to provide intuition, so we do not want you to just write some math and nothing else. You can use some math to sort of clarify your answer or the like, but you always need to provide a verbal explanation and some intuition and some explanation of why you think the answer might be, or the statement might be true, false, or uncertain. For multiple choice questions, essentially you're given different choices and you just pick one answer and no further explanation. Very simple. And then there will be sort of PSET style questions that are sort of you're familiar with, either from like the PSETs or like previous exams. These will be quite similar to the PSET question. They will be sort of generally not on the hardest side, just we only have so much time to do this. There will be some algebra involved. Again, please always explain your answers carefully. Now, what materials are you responsible for? You're responsible for the lectures up to and including lecture 12, which is the lecture on March 11, up to slide 67 of lectures 11, or lecture, the notes for a lecture, the handout of the notes for lectures 11 to 13. You're also responsible for recitations 1 through 5, recitations 6, which is the recitation that Will gave, which is quite similar to this one, and 7, this recitation, various reviews that might be helpful for some of you, but there's no new material that you need to study now. PSETs 1 to 3 are sort of part of the deal. And readings, start and non-start readings, cited in class are only relevant to the extent that they appear in lectures and or recitation. That's to say, like if I discuss a certain paper and the content of that paper, that's discussed in the class is relevant to you. However, anything that's in the paper that doesn't appear in the lecture is not relevant, as in like you're not going to ask you questions that sort of ask about some obscure details of the papers that you never heard about in class. How do you get ready for the exam? Well, you study the lecture and presentation slides carefully. You should make sure you're familiar and comfortable with the PSETs and the solutions, make sure you understand and are able to solve the PSETs on your own. A great resource to practice is previous PSETs and exams. Again, readings start and non-start are not required, but they may sort of help you deepen your understanding of the material. Maybe sometimes the lecture notes are a little bit dense and don't have that much detail. So you can sort of like try to consult them and try to understand the materials better, but we won't ask you about the details of those readings beyond what was beyond those details that were always covered in class. So let me now sort of like review the material overall and sort of give you a sense of what are the kinds of things that we want you to know. To be clear, this is not exhaustive in the sense of like there are some other materials in the lecture slides that I'm not mentioning here. What I'm trying to do here is just give you a sense of what are the most important key things that you should know. Those will cover perhaps like 80–90% of the material that's actually potentially in the exam. Having said that, you should sure to go through the entire lecture slides and make sure you sort of gather everything and understand what's going on there. Okay, so the first thing we discussed was time preferences, in particular the exponential discounting model. Here you should know what is the exponential discounting model, What is delta, the time preference parameter in that model? What does it measure? How can we estimate it, assuming that an exponential discounting model is correct? Further, what are the main assumptions of the exponential discounting model? And what evidence do we have against those assumptions? So in lectures 3 and 4, I discussed those assumptions and the evidence against those assumptions in detail. And after that, we discussed the quasi-hyperbolic discounting model, which is a relatively small modification of the exponential discounting model. Again, you should know what is this model, how it's different from the exponential discounting model, and of course the difference is that there's a present bias parameter, beta, that is added to this model, which measures short-run discounting as like how much weight you put on the present versus everything else that's in the future. Now, what empirical evidence can the quasi-exponential, quasi-hyperbolic model explain better than the exponential discount model, and why is that? So you should be familiar with, for example, things like preference reversals or demand for commitment. Why is that consistent with the quasi-hyperbolic model? And you know, why is it not consistent with the exponential model? Of course, that's what we discussed in the previous slide. These are some of the assumptions of the exponential discounting model. Or, for example, one of the key assumptions are that there are no preference reversals, and we discussed that in detail. Then, of course, you need to know in the quasi-hyperbolic discounting model, what is this sophistication, what is naivete, and what is partial naivete. So what does beta measure? What does beta hat measure? What is full sophistication, full naivete, and partial naivete? And answer questions such as like, does sophistication make people always better off, and why or why not, if that's the case. Further, you should understand what is demand for commitment, who demands commitment and who doesn't. So like, are fully sophisticated or fully naive people or partial naive people potentially demanding commitment? What are the conditions under which somebody demands commitment? And what kinds of people do not do demand commitment, and what kinds of people benefit from doing so? And in particular, can people be worse off from being offered a commitment device, and why is that, or why not? Next, we discuss in quite a bit of detail empirical applications from a range of different settings. This is lectures 5 and 6. So we want you to be familiar with those empirical applications. You should understand whether quasi-hyperbolic model can explain or cannot explain some of the empirical evidence better than the exponential discounting model. And you know, kind of like why do we think the quasi-hyperbolic model is a good fit for some of the empirical examples that I have shown. Then you need to be able to solve problems. These are sort of similar problems to the problems in the problem sets that you've seen before. Problem sets where people are either like exponential discounters, or like for beta, delta equals, or beta equals 1, and delta being like either 1 or 0.95 or close to 1. Quasi-hyperbolic discounters, and again, like fully naive, fully sophisticated, partially naive agents. How does one solve such problems? Of course, we have plenty of practice already in the PSET and midterm examples, also in some finals. So you should sort of use backwards or forwards induction or iteration, depending on the case. I sort of discussed this in slide 62 of lectures 3 and 4, and slide 37 of lectures 5 and 6. There's also recitation that covers that in detail, so you should have plenty of practice of doing so. Now, let me now give you sort of some examples of like, what are some examples of true, false on certain questions, and how should you answer them. So let me sort of just read the statements for you, and you can think about this for a second, and then I'm going to give you the answer. So consider individuals with beta delta preferences. This is quasi-hyperbolic discounters who only differ by their present bias, and have like beta equals between 0 and 1. And suppose there's a commitment savings device available, the willingness to pay for this commitment device strictly decreases in beta. Now, is that true or false statements? The answer is this statement is false. Now, why is that? Well, there's, again, like if you just write false, that's not going to give you full credit, even if in fact, the statement is false. What you need to do is you need to sort of provide some further explanation. Ideally, provide us like a somewhat detailed explanation. So ideally, if you think it's false, if you provide several examples, that should be better than just one. In this case, why is it false? Well, individuals might be naive, right? So if, in particular, if people are fully naive, they will not be willing to pay for anything for commitment devices. So regardless of the beta, willingness to pay will always be zero, so it will surely not decrease in beta. Second, the commitment device may just not be effective at all. If the commitment device is useless, it doesn't matter what beta is, nobody will demand commitment anyway. And finally, even if individuals, this is a little bit more trickier explanation, and I wouldn't necessarily expect you to know that answer, but even if individuals are fully sophisticated and the device is effective, the commitment device is effective, willingness to pay may not be strictly decreasing in beta. And here's sort of an example. Well, if beta equals 0, beta equals 1, then individuals would be willing to pay 0 for the commitment device, right? Because if beta equals 0, they don't care about the future. If beta equals 1, they just don't need any commitment devices. But in between, the willingness to pay might be positive for beta between 0 and 1. That essentially means that willingness to pay would be sort of an inverse U in beta. Again, that's a bit of a tricky answer, like the third bullet point, you wouldn't necessarily expect you to know that answer, but you should be able to say or to answer reason 1 or reason 2 in a specific case. Second example, statement, fully sophisticated individuals can experience large welfare losses from their present bias. The answer is this is true. Why is that? Let me think about this for a second. Well, the answer is that awareness of present bias, that is like sophistication, does not remove present bias. Even if people are sophisticated, the present bias is still there. There might be some commitment devices, some ways in which people are able to overcome their sort of the losses associated with present bias. But in the absence of commitment devices, people may still make suboptimal decisions, and some of these decisions might in fact induce large welfare needs. We discussed some examples in class, some numerical examples where you could see that sophisticated people might actually be worse off than naive people and could in fact suffer quite a bit from or relatively large welfare losses from that present bias. All of this is evaluated by their long-run utility, as in like if somebody makes choices for the future where the beta is sort of not relevant, compared to sort of that kind of welfare criterion, people might be a lot worse off due to their welfare, due to their present bias. Okay, here's example number 3. Present bias individuals always have positive demand for commitment devices. Again, the statement is false. Why is that? And you kind of discussed this already in the previous questions. And let me sort of be very explicit. There's sort of 3 conditions that must be met for positive demand for commitment. I discussed this in class. The person must be present bias or have some form of self-control problems. The person must be aware of their present bias, so they can't be fully naive. They could be partially naive, but they can't be fully naive. And the individual must perceive the commitment device as effective in helping overcome the self-control problem. That's to say, if somebody is offered a commitment device and that commitment device is useless, well, there's not going to be any demand for commitment, particularly if the person perceives that the commitment device is useless. Notice that that person might actually perceive the commitment device to be effective, while in reality is not. So they might have some positive demand for commitment, even if the commitment device is in reality useless because their beliefs are wrong because of essentially some form of partial naivete. But it cannot be that the person perceives the commitment device as not effective because then the person would just not demand it in the first place. Now that makes now the statement false when only the first condition of the 3 is met, as in like the person's only present bias, then we cannot be sure that there will be positive demand for commitment. Right, and so the statement, as it is said, is false because we said sort of like always have positive demand for commitment. If it were without the always, then you could also answer like uncertain, because then you would say, well, it depends on the naivete or the sophistication, or it depends on how effective the commitment device is. But the way the statement is written, it says like always, and so now you can easily come up with some counterexamples that show that the statement, in fact, is false. Okay. The second topic that we discussed after time preferences was risk preferences, in particular expected utility. So here, you need to have a clear understanding of what is the expected utility model, what is risk aversion, why are people risk averse, how is risk aversion specifically modeled in the expected utility model, what is the expected monetary value, and also things like what is concavity and what does concavity have to do, what is the expected utility versus the expected monetary value, and what does the concavity imply for risk aversion in the expected utility model. Then next, how can we measure risk aversion within the expected utility model? In particular, we discussed three types of ways of measuring risk aversion. We discussed certainty equivalence, we discussed choices from gambles, we also discussed insurance choices. This is a Sidner paper. And then we discussed what is problematic about the estimates of risk aversion in the expected utility model. In particular, we discussed evidence that found that there tends to be substantial small-scale risk aversion. So when you give people small gambles, they tend to be quite risk averse, so they tend to be have a quite high gamma. But we know also from large-scale choices that the risk aversion cannot be actually that high. Or when people make these choices, people leave the house every day and engage in quite a few risks in the long run. They hold stocks and so on. That must mean that their long run, when using sort of long run choices, that implies essentially a relatively low gamma. Now, since the expected utility model only has like one parameter, it cannot explain both of those features, and sort of it always has trouble. So essentially, if you try to match small scale risk aversion, then you need to have a very large gamma, high gamma. And if you try to match large scale risk aversion, you need to have a low gamma, and that sort of brings trouble because you can't just explain both of those things. And sort of Matthew Rabin and Thaler, as well as Recitation 4, discuss this conundrum, this issue, in quite a bit of detail. Next, we discuss Kahneman and Tversky's 1979 prospect theory. This is a seminal paper, and if you remember just a few papers from this class, this is one of the papers that you should really know about. And so what evidence in Kahneman and Tversky is inconsistent with expected utility? Well, in particular, so there are several things in there, but we discussed mostly one feature, which is risk aversion in the game domain and risk lovingness in the loss domain. And so now, what are the most important points from Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory? This is sort of the proposed alternative to expected utility. This is slide 3 of 51 of lecture 9. Well, there's sort of three features discussed there. One is like changes rather than levels or the arguments of the utility function. Then there's loss aversion. So there's a kink of the utility function around the reference point. And there's diminishing sensitivity, meaning there's the utility function is concave in the game domain when you're sort of above the reference point, and is convex in the loss domain when you're below the reference point. Okay, so now what does sort of this proposed alternative utility or value function look like? How does it incorporate the three features? Again, we sort of discussed this, and that's utility function in lecture 9 that sort of talks about this in detail. Or the lecture talks about this utility function in detail. One key question here then is like, how is the reference point determined? What are some candidate reference points? So one candidate would be the status quo, another reference point candidate would be expectation, but there could be also other things such as goal and aspirations. Recitation 5 discusses this a little bit, not in too much detail. Now, then we discussed empirical evidence. In particular, what empirical evidence of loss aversion do we have? We talked about small-scale gambles. We talked about the endowment effect in particular. And then we discussed some applications in lecture 9. So what are these applications? We discussed labor supply, the housing market, stocks, marathon running, and golf. So you should be familiar with these empirical applications from lecture 9. You should in particular understand why reference-dependent preferences can explain some of the empirical evidence that showed better than the expected utility models. You should understand, is some of the evidence that we see consistent with the expected utility model, and why, if not, why not? And why is the reference-dependent model, or in particular, which feature of the reference-dependent model can explain well? So what are the features again? Changes rather than levels, sort of some reference point, reference dependence, the loss aversion, and diminishing rate sensitivity. So which feature is actually important in explaining things? We focus mostly on loss aversion. What is not relevant is the deal or no deal evidence and the paper by Pearson and all. There's a couple of slides at the end of lecture 9 that I didn't really cover or didn't cover at all. So we're not going to ask any questions about that. So now, how do you solve problems with reference-dependent preferences? You can sort of see problem set 3, question number 1 had some questions about this. And again, there's additional PSET and exam questions that you can practice with. So there are quite a few of those kinds of questions. Now, here's sort of an example of a multiple choice question. Here's so Maddie wrote this question. So Maddie, in fact, appears. The question is, Maddie is writing a problem set for 1413. She gets utility U of Q from the number of questions she writes. She has reference-dependent preferences around the goal of writing 10 questions. 10 is her reference point. If you normalize the utility of 10 questions to 0, which of the following would be consistent with loss aversion? I'll let you have a look at this. So there's option A, U of 8 equals -2, U of 12 equals 1. U of 8, and number B, option B, U of 8 equals -2, U of 12 equals 2. And then number C is, option C is U of 8 equals -1, and U of 12 equals 2. So which of those answers is consistent with loss aversion? The answer is option A. Now, why is that? Well, loss aversion sort of implies that losses hurt more than gains help. So with preferences as in A, Maddie would have a utility cost of 2 from falling short of her goal of 2 questions, but only a gain of 1 util from exceeding her goal by 2 questions, right? So the goal, the gain of exceeding of being by 2 questions above, so being 2 questions above gives her some gain of 1 util, but the utility cost of falling short is 2 is twice as large, which just tends to be kind of like the evidence that we would see in loss aversion. And the other 2 examples don't have that feature, so really only answer number A is correct. Second question. Maddie is walking home and passes a bakery. Unexpectedly, she decides to buy a pastry. For example, she looks at the pastry and it looks really nice. Prior to purchasing the pastry, her maximum willingness to pay for the pastry was P0. Then she runs into Alan, this is our previous excellent TA, who asks to buy the pastry from her. She offers him the lowest price she's willing to accept, P1. Which of the following comparisons between P0 and P1 is consistent with an endowment effect? P0 larger than P1, P0 equals P1, or P0 smaller than P1? The answer is answer number C. Why is that? Well, the endowment effect says that people are, when their willingness to pay, in this case P0, is smaller than their willingness to accept when they're selling something. That is to say, being endowed with an item, in this case like a pastry, increases one's willingness to pay. That is to say, if somebody asks you to sell something that you own, you ask for more money than you're willing to pay in the first place when you don't own the item. And so the endowment effect will then predict that, or the endowment effect entails that now P1 is larger than P0, which is answer number C. So Maddie values the pastry more after she has bought it compared to like prior to buying Okay. The third broad set of preferences that we discussed were social preferences. We didn't quite finish with this, so we're not going to cover everything, in particular not lecture 13, and the estimation part of like social preferences, which will be in part from choices, which will be at preset 4. You should understand what social preferences are. You should also understand how can we measure social preferences in lab games. We discussed at length the dictator game, the ultimatum game, and the trust game. You should also be broadly familiar, not in detail, but broadly familiar with what evidence do we typically find in dictator and ultimatum games. For instance, in dictator games, people tend to give something like 20 to 30% of their share. So people tend to be quite nice in those games. Now, then we discussed then, like, given that evidence, so given that people look quite nice in these types of games, people also, there's also some other evidence people give and share to charity or things like that. Now, do we think that is evidence of people being generally nice to others because of poor altruism? Or if not, why not? We discussed sort of 3 sets of evidence in particular. We discussed the costly exit or exit options in dictator games, where people essentially, when they're able to leave the dictator game, they rather sort of leave and give sort of keep the money, or they're even willing to pay some small amount of money to leave the dictator game and not having to face some other person, but they then feel compelled to give to others. There was the option of hiding behind a computer. So if a computer, if a computer gives you the option to hide behind the computer and to be mean to others, you might take advantage of that and actually be meaner than you would be otherwise. So like altruism or people's giving tends to go down quite a bit when they're able to hide behind the computer. And then there's, so both of those types of pieces of evidence are evidence of social image being important in giving. People care a lot about what others think, in particular what others think about them, and they don't want to upset others. And so if they are able to avoid those kinds of situations, they might want to do that, which would suggest that it's not really that they want others to do well in the sense of that they really want others to have money or have more money than before, but rather it's because of social pressure or social image concerns people might give in dictator or ultimatum games. Moreover, there's some evidence of like self-image about people caring about their what they think about themselves. They want to think of themselves as being a good person, and so the evidence of the moral wiggle room seems to suggest that these concerns are quite important. In particular, people are engaging in some behavior where they sort of delude themselves that they are in fact are nice, when in reality they're not. And so that's discussed in detail in the lecture. Again, we will not ask you to, you should be kind of familiar with this type of evidence, and you should be familiar why that sort of tells us that people are perhaps not as nice as you might have thought. They are just coming from like dictator ultimatum games or from like donations. We will not ask you about models that estimate social preferences. That will be in problem set 4, so don't worry about that. So the stuff on like Charnitz and Rabin, that's there. We will not ask you about that. Okay. So then here's another example of a true, false, uncertain question. Statement: if a person gives a 0 in a dictator game, this is evidence that this person is selfish. Now, the answer is false. I think if you answer it uncertain, that would also be fine. Why is that? Well, the person might give a 0 to the other person in the dictator game and then donate the money to someone in greater need, right? And then that person is in fact really quite nice. Second, the person might be very poor relative to the other person in the game, so her marginal utility is just very high. So now, even if you have like equal weights to like your own utility and the other person's utility, since the marginal utility of giving $10 to yourself compared to the other person is way higher than the other person's marginal utility, you might just give everything to yourself. And that doesn't mean you don't care about others. It just means like, in fact, even if you were sort of like a social planner, you would give it to that person because that person is like in huge need, while the rich person just might not really need that money. Looking at this more closely, actually, I think uncertain would be a better answer here, and not false. I just wrote this question fairly quickly. So if the question says, If the question instead were to say this is conclusive evidence that this person is selfish, then it would be false, or this is clearly evidence, or this person must be selfish. That would be false. The way it's written right now, it's rather sort of uncertain because we just don't quite know. It could be that the person is really selfish, or it could be that the person, it could be that this evidence that the person is selfish, but it could be the other two reasons that I just mentioned. Okay, so now finally I'm going to give you a long question, or an example of a long question, and this is the question of laptop policies. We talked about this a little bit earlier in class, in fact, in the first lecture, and we had the first problem said about this, and this is sort of like an algebraic version of that kind of question. So assume the 1413 students are present biased with beta smaller than 1 and delta equals 0. All students have the same beta smaller than 1 and delta equals 0, but they differ in the value they derive from using laptops in class L. L is constant for each student from class to class, but uniformly distributed across students on the interval between 0 and 1. Okay, so there's some people have like a huge value of using the laptop in class, and others do not. Each lecture generates no immediate utility, so it's neither fun nor like annoying or the like, but it does give a benefit, a future benefit of V. Okay, so like you might learn something, or some things that might be valuable to you in the future. Using a laptop reduces the long run benefit by D. This might be, like distractions in particular. So you might be distracted during class when you use a laptop. So the future benefits are diminished by that. Maybe you said something really insightful, you can pay attention, and so now the benefits is B minus D if you use a laptop. Both V and D are the same for all students, so there's no variation across students there. The only variation is coming from like some students who really like using laptops for various reasons, perhaps because they like to surf on the internet. Perhaps they're really in need of using laptops because that allows them to take proper notes. So in summary, a student uses a laptop in class, a student that uses the laptop in class gets immediate utility L and future undiscounted utility of V minus D. And a student who does not use a laptop gets immediate utility of 0 and future discounted utility of V. So, and now the social planner is not present biased and seeks to maximize the utility of 1413 students from his perspective. Okay. First question. Show that students are just indifferent between using and not using their laptop in the current class if L equals beta times D. Explain why students with lower values of L, so that's like L being lower than beta D, don't use laptops in class, while students with higher values of L, so L exceeds beta D, do use laptops in class. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to write down the utilities from the two choices. That's essentially already given in the explanation, except for that we need to be careful where the beta comes in, right? So if students use a laptop in class, they get the immediate benefit of L, and then in the future they get what's discounted by beta, which is beta times V minus D, right? Because both V and D are very far in the future. These are the benefits, or the diminished benefits, V minus D, that they get in the future. L is in the present, so there's no beta here. Instead, if somebody uses no laptop, the students get 0, so there's no laptop benefits in the present, and the benefits in the future are, the value of the lecture in the future is undiminished, which means essentially it's just V, so the person just gets 0 plus beta times V. Now, students who are indifferent, by definition, have the same utility of using laptops and using no laptop, so we can essentially just equate those two things. It's notice that like the beta times V is always there, so it sort of essentially just cancels, and then what we get is the person that's indifferent, for that person, L equals beta times D. Now, students that choose not to use laptops will have low valuations, L, of using the laptops, while students that choose to use the laptops will have high L, right? If the L is really, if L is very large, then it exceeds beta times D. If L is very small, then L does not exceed, is smaller than beta times D. So given sort of the indifference condition, we have essentially, as I just said, students that do not use the laptop, L is smaller than beta times D, and students that use the laptop, for them, L is larger than beta times D. Okay, now question number 2. Now consider the policy that allows students to use laptops only if they sign up in advance to sit in a laptop section. It's a little bit different than we had in class, but it's a version or something that I also considered. In fact, in previous years, that was what was used. Now, the question here is, why is L larger equal than D, not L is larger equal than beta D, the threshold for opting into the laptop section? Okay, so now this is a choice where people choose not for the present, whether when they come to class, whether they want to use a laptop right now, but instead they sign up in advance to sit in a laptop section for the rest of the semester. So essentially people are in the present and they choose for the future whether they can use laptops in class. Now, the utility is now different, and the key difference is that the laptop benefits are now in the future, right? So the utility of using a laptop now again is 0 in the present. So this is, again, we make choices in the present for the future. There's no utility in the present. There's no lecture right now, no laptop benefits or the like. And in the future, everything is discounted by beta now because the person is present biased, potentially. So it's beta times L plus B minus D. The utility of not using a laptop is just 0, again, like in the present nothing happens, and then in the future the benefits as before are beta times B. So the only thing, if you compare this choice or these two options to the previous version, is the L now is discounted by beta, but before it was not. Let me just go back here. So here you see the L was like sort of, here you see the L is not discounted by beta. This is when people make choices for the present. Instead, here now the L is discounted by beta because that choice is the laptop benefits are in the future. Now we can do the same thing as before. Threshold for opting in is defined as like, or you can say that's essentially the indifference condition. So you can just equalize the two, the utility of using the laptop or not using the laptop. And what you now get is that if L is larger than D or larger equals than D, then the person uses the laptop, and otherwise they do not. Now, why does the threshold now change from beta times D to D? Well, because when laptop use can only happen in the future, all benefits and costs are discounted at the same rate, and then that rate is beta. Okay, question number 3. Assume there's no laptop policy at all. Show that if beta times D is smaller than L and smaller than D, the student engages in preference reversals. She prefers not to use the laptop in future classes, but changes her mind when she's actually sitting on those future classes. That's sort of essentially the typical behavior of present bias people, that when they're present bias, for at least some parameter constellations, people engage in present bias. So let's do the math and see what comes out here. So when thinking about future laptop use, the student's problem is identical to the problem in part in part 2. Why is that? Well, because she discounts time both 1 and 2 periods in advance by beta. Essentially, everything is in the future, so you just discounts everything by beta. That's exactly kind of the choice that we just had. So when thinking about future classes, or when thinking about opting into the laptop section, the person makes a choice for the future. So here, when she thinks about any future choices, what really matters is essentially the value of the laptop is in the future, and we're back in like part 2 that we just solved. We know from part 2 that if L equals smaller than D, then she would like to not use the laptop, right? So we just solve for that in part number 2. But from part number 1, we know that if beta D is smaller than L, she will end up using the laptop when she's actually sitting in a future class. That is to say, if she has a choice in any given class and shows up in class, she will say, oh, like using a laptop would be great. Same would be true of phones, by the way. When she has a choice in any given class that happens right now, if beta D equals smaller than L, she will end up using the laptop in class. So that implies essentially like a preference reversal using these parameter assumptions. She prefers not to use the laptop in future classes, but switches her mind or changes her mind when she's actually sitting in those future classes. Okay, question number 4. Explain why the fraction 1 minus beta d of the class uses a laptop in part 1, but fraction 1 minus d of the class uses a laptop in part 2. Why does a smaller share of the class use their laptop in part 2? Okay, so now we're just essentially comparing part 1 and part 2, and I'm going to look at like what fraction of people are actually using the laptop. So we can sort of do the math version and think about like why that answer makes sense. So in part 1, a student uses the laptop if L equals is larger than beta times D. If F is the CDF of L and then there's a period missing, but sort of define F as the CDF of L, and then given the uniform distribution, the probability of L being larger than beta D is 1 minus the CDF, 1 minus F of beta delta, which is, since it's uniform, it's just 1 minus beta D. Now, likewise, in part 2, a student uses a laptop if L is larger than D, so we have the probability of L being larger than D is 1 minus the CDF or F of D, which is 1 minus D. So a smaller share uses the laptop in part 2 because the benefit of using a laptop is delayed and hence discounted by beta. So, why is that? Well, essentially, think about it like this. If somebody has beta equals 1, which is kind of equivalent to like part 2 when people make choices for the future, if you use a laptop, so a share of people will like the laptop or you would like to use the laptop when making choices for the future, not because of self-control problems or the like, but just because they find laptops really helpful in taking notes. Now, if then a person in addition is present bias and makes a choice for the present, that enhances the short run benefits, because now the L is not discounted by beta anymore. Now it's essentially it's given sort of the benefit it's in the present, and everything else beta is in the future. And so that means essentially that when making choices for the present, the present benefits, the L gets more weight relative to everything else, which is gets the weight of beta less than 1. And so now if you already, when making choices for the future, chose a laptop anyway, that implies that you also choose the laptop for the present. Essentially, anybody who chooses a laptop for the future will also choose a laptop for the present. And now there are some people essentially who don't have like huge variation. They might not choose the laptop for the future, but they might choose it. They will choose it for the present because of their present bias. And therefore, then the fraction of people who choose for the present will be larger than the fraction of people who choose for the future, which we just showed using some algebra. Okay. Then finally, why would the social planner prefer the opt-in policy to both the policy of allowing students to choose whether to use their laptops and to banning laptops altogether? Okay, so let's think about this, the opt-in policy. What does that really entail? Well, the opt-in policy, as we said, is the planner is not present bias. So the planner would only want students with L being larger than D to use laptops. And so the opt-in policy, as we just showed above, achieves this. So that's great. Under like a free choice policy instead, students with beta times D smaller than L smaller than D will suboptimally use their laptops, and the social planner does not like this. On the other hand, banning laptops altogether is suboptimal because welfare is gained by allowing the students with the highest valuations with L equals, L larger than D to use laptops, right? So banning laptops is not great because essentially there's some people who really would love to use their laptops regardless of present bias, and not allowing that is not great. Free choice is not great because essentially once you let people choose any given day, temptation will sort of kick in, and some people will suboptimally use their laptops and just surf on the internet all day or all class and not learn very much. And instead, so the policy where people opt in for the future essentially achieves sort of the objective of the social planner, who wants only students with L larger than D to use their laptops, and sort of the social planner will be happy and therefore prefer that policy over both free choice and over banning laptops. Okay, so that's the end. That's all I had to say about getting ready for the exam. Again, I think you should prepare well, try to look at the materials. Please ask any questions in case things are unclear. Again, I have office hours on Friday, April 3rd at 4:30 to 6. I emailed you about that. Pierre-Luc also has office hours from 1:30 to 3:30. Again, that's in my email. If you have questions, please let us know, in particular on Piazza or during office hours. But in any case, please do not worry too much about the exam. Try your best and you will do great. But even if you don't do great, you'll be fine. You will pass this class as long as you take the exam and write something that is remotely reasonable. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you in class soon.